Let's talk about JD. So, from my own personal experience, it seems to me that JD comes across as a controversial character in the Gears of War lore. Obviously, I can't provide any data or stats to validate this claim, but if I were to go into the Gears of War subreddit and ask for a general opinion on JD, I'd likely get a mixed bag of answers. Some people think that Gears 5 added a lot to his character, and others feel the exact opposite. Some seem to think that JD is uninteresting or stale, and others don't. Now, for every character, you're going to have some people who think that that character isn't good. This just happens with everybody. But the reason why it matters so much in the case of JD is because he's more than one of the main characters. He's the son of the Gears character, Marcus Fenix. This puts a lot of pressure on JD, not only from a meta story perspective, that is, we as fans of Gears of War expect a lot out of him, but also from the in-universe perspective. And it's this in-universe perspective that serves to define much of who JD is. To talk about who JD is, it's important to go back and look at his family as a whole. If we look at who JD came from, it'll be a lot easier to talk about who JD is, and his character will make much more sense to us. So, to start, it's well known that JD is the son of Marcus Fenix and Anya Stroud. Both of these names are incredibly influential and significant in the Gears of War universe, and for good reason. We all know that Marcus Fenix is the hero of the Locust War. Almost all of the COG's most wide-sweeping offensive victories were carried out, in part thanks to Marcus Fenix. These victories essentially being the first three Gears of War games: the Lightmass bombing, which saw the extinction of the Krill; the flooding of the Hollow in Gears 2, which uprooted the Locusts and essentially broke the back of their military; and the Emulsion countermeasure, which ultimately destroyed the Locust horde and ended the war. These events are Marcus's most famous, but they're not his character-defining moments. Marcus, although a hero to the COG, bore witness to a number of dark atrocities committed by the government throughout his career. And it's these unsung moments that eventually lead up to the Marcus Fenix we currently have today, who is untrustworthy and disillusioned with the COG. Even when his wife Anya Stroud was first minister. Anya Stroud is JD's mother, and much like Marcus, had a significant influence in the Locust War and on the COG in general. She was a very successful officer during the Locust War, serving as not only a communications officer, which is an important role in the military, but also later serving as a frontline gear, making her a very unique type of soldier that the COG was in rare supply of. Anya Stroud, more importantly though, served as First Minister over the new COG, and it's her administration that ushered in the fertility program. This program is the most influential administrative accomplishment the new COG has seen, and as such, it makes Anya's legacy arguably more impactful on the society as it stands currently than Marcus Fenix is. So, Anya and Marcus are famous for a very particular reason. They're both heroes, they're leaders, and not only just these two, but their parents before them. Adam Fenix was the premier COG military scientist of his time. He was key in bringing about the Hammer of Dawn strikes, which stemmed the Locust tide early on in the war, and he devised the Emulsion countermeasure. In a way, Adam Fenix is not only a COG hero, but one of the most important humans to exist on Serra. And Adam's father was himself a high-ranking military officer in the COG. Similarly for Anya, her mother Helena Stroud was a decorated gear who served on the front lines of the Pendulum Wars as an officer. Notably, during her time active in the war, Helena served alongside Adam Fenix himself, though they were not in a relation like Marcus and Anya. Helena was posthumously awarded the Embry Star, the highest award that can be given to a COG soldier. As we can see, both sides of JD's family line are known for heroism. Both sides have seen Embry Stars. Both sides have sacrificed greatly for the COG. Both sides bring about some of the greatest COG soldiers the military has seen. So, for JD, his personality and behavior is about more than just his father's example. It's about the example set forth by his entire family tree. He's the cross between two legendary bloodlines, and also, in a way, the last member of the Fenix Stroud line that can carry the torch of these families into the future. This speaks to what I consider JD's most prominent personality trait. That is, JD is a very pro-COG type of character. Now, in spite of what the COG's responsible for, this trait alone doesn't make JD a sort of immoral character, not by any means. It makes sense that he's a COG type of person. That's the legacy that JD comes from. He's a product of his circumstances. He would have been heavily influenced by his heritage from a young age. We know from the Gears of War 4 trailer, for instance, that JD grew up in a household with his mother Anya, who would have been First Minister at that time. As a child, he would have been very impressionable, and the close ties his family has to the COG would undoubtedly rub off on him and influence his personality going forward. An example of this would be the collectible in Gears of War 4, where, when you get to the estate to find Marcus, you can find a toy COG soldier that belonged to JD, and this inclination towards the COG would extend into JD's adulthood. As we all know, JD joined the COG military academy to train as an officer. The letter approving him to join the program can be found as a collectible in Gears of War 4. Interestingly enough, the letter talks about how the officer program will require, quote, a series of severe mental readjustments. That's a very specific way to put it. Obviously, JD passed the academy with flying colors. This is likely due in part to the influence his family has within COG history, in other words, nepotism. But it's probably more likely to do with the fact that JD is a natural leader. That is to be expected given who JD was raised by. But the drawback is that if you're the leader, then you need to be prepared to make tough decisions and handle difficult situations. What I'm getting at here is the incident which led to both Dell and JD leaving the COG. That is, the Settlement 2 protest massacre. So, this is the question I'm going to answer. Why did the Settlement 2 massacre go down the way that it did? One thing that I haven't been able to establish is who the highest ranking officer was during this massacre. Was it Foz or JD? I ask this because the answer entails a certain psychological state. We know that JD gave the order, but if he wasn't technically in charge, then it means he superseded control of the situation from Chutani. In my opinion, this implies that JD, in that moment, felt the need to prove himself during a difficult situation, rather than simply trying to maintain control of a situation and keep it from getting out of hand. These two sound similar, but there is a difference. It's the difference between somebody trying to do their job and somebody who's trying to make a point. And I think it's the latter. That is, JD felt the need to make a point and inadvertently worsened the situation. There are reasons why this would be the case. The first is just because of everything I said previously. about how JD is under a lot of pressure to establish himself in the Fenix Stroud bloodline. During this period of COG history, there wouldn't be hardly any chances to do this, however. Remember, the COG isn't at war at this point in time. There's general peace, and so opportunities to rise through the ranks and make a name for yourself are very slim. This is further evidenced by the simple fact that this seems to be the only notable event in JD's career prior to the Swarm outbreak. Reason number 2 is that JD would have also been under pressure to prove his dad wrong, and Marcus Fenix was very much against JD joining the COG. Being able to quell a riot sends a message, specifically to his father, that message being something like, "I can handle this job despite your feelings about the COG. I'm a leader. I'm JD Fenix." Number 3, JD has a sort of impulsive side to him, where he makes these types of high-risk, on-the-spot decisions. Obviously, the big example of this just is this event we're talking about, the Settlement 2 massacre. But this happens elsewhere. We see it twice in Gears 5. The first time is in Azura, the place you go to at the start of the game, where JD puts Delta Squad at risk by attempting to open the Silo Bay hatch, in spite of warnings from both Marcus Fenix and Baird. JD was successful, but this was obviously a colossal risk that could have gotten the entire team killed, and it wasn't necessary. Marcus Fenix even chastises JD for this decision later on in the story. He makes a similar decision again at the end of the battle for Settlement 2. This is the scene where JD uses himself as a beacon for the Hammer of Dun, a very dangerous idea, and this ends up backfiring. Luckily, JD doesn't die, but Baird ends up losing control of the hammer, and without any set beacons or coordinate targeting solutions, the hammer fires indiscriminately. The result is that the convoy JD wanted to save ends up getting destroyed anyway. And obviously, the worst fact about that whole situation is that Lizzie Carmine died. I still haven't gotten over that one. Yep. There is one other situation in particular that comes to mind from the book Ascendance, but I personally feel that this was the best move that JD could have made in that situation. I won't go into specifics, but JD saved himself and Dell by forcing them both to leap into a moving condor from atop an extremely tall radio tower. So anyway, JD has this sort of high-risk impulsive side. Sometimes it's necessary and sometimes it isn't. This all goes back into why JD made that notorious decision at Settlement 2. Why Settlement 2 happened is because JD is a very COG character. He would have likely held some animosity toward those protesters to begin with. He has a legacy of leadership that he feels he needs to live up to, and chances to do that are slim. And he has an impulsive side that manifests itself on occasion. It's these traits that serve to drive the wedge between him, Dale, and Kate later on in Gears 5, and more broadly speaking, his dad Marcus Fenix. Kate even comments on it at one point during Act 2 of Gears 5, where she states that she had no idea how COG JD is. In Gears 5, we're told that in the months following the evacuation of Settlement 2, JD pushed away Dale and Kate and in their place grew closer with Foz. We don't know any specifics relating to what JD did or how he behaved during the time gaps in Gears 5. We know he's been promoted to captain at this point, and in the cutscene where Kate finds out that Oscar died, he acts in a sort of harsh and callous manner. This is probably what Foz referred to as, quote, Dark JD. It's a version of JD that we haven't been exposed to yet, and it stands in stark contrast to the JD that we've come to know in Gears of War 4, where, in Gears 4, JD went out of his way to help Kate and even stood against the cog. Gears 5 is where JD does the opposite thing. He doesn't help his friends and in fact attempts to stop Kate. He stands with the cog in this game. And interestingly, JD switches again later on in the story. In Act 3, both he and Foz decide to help Kate and Dell, and importantly, they do so without authorization from Jen. What I'm getting at is that JD is a character who is split between two different identities, and the struggle of his character revolves around this divide. On the one hand, he has his pro-cog side, duty to the military, to order, to leadership, and so on. The side that's about setting aside personal feelings in order to accomplish the objective. And on the other hand, there's this side of JD that's all about loyalty to his allies, his friends. This side is not pro-cog, and even defies the expectations placed on him by his bloodline. The means do not always justify the ends with this side of JD. And I might be reading into this a little too much, but I think that this divide kind of gets back at the Stroud-Fenix family line duality. Marcus Fenix is an anti-cog character, and his father Adam Fenix, while not being openly against the cog, often struggled to reconcile many of the decisions made by the cog. For instance, he felt great shame and remorse following the Hammer of Dun strikes. Contrast this with the Stroud family line, and you don't get this same degree of friction with the cog and its power. And, I mean, Anya did become first minister of it at one point. All I'm hinting at is that there is a sort of contrast or dichotomy between these two families with their relation to the cog itself. And for JD, who is the cross between these two, it's an interesting and unique split within his personality, and I think this is the reason why, when we look at one of the most iconic scenes in Gears 5, you see that it's JD who stands in the middle, that scene being the one where Jen tried to force Kate back into the hive mind. Look at this shot closely. It's sort of a symbol for the internal conflict that's going on in JD, and I think that his reaction to Jen perfectly captures the idea that, despite everything that still happened, JD is still caught between these two opposing identities and isn't sure which one to turn to. If you look at it, JD doesn't point his gun at Jen. He puts a hand on the Onyx guard, but he doesn't stand in the way of them, and he could have done those things. Now, before I finish this video, it's only fair that I discuss some of the negative sides to JD's character. There are two main problems with him, and I think both of these problems feed into why a lot of people consider him to be underdeveloped. The first is that JD doesn't stand out from the crowd, not as a character at least. Consider Dell, for instance. Dell has several character traits, and two of them are immediately recognizable. He's a funny and witty type of guy. He can make light of situations and has a lot of sarcasm. And he's very smart and knowledgeable. These things help Dell stand out in particular. They let him occupy his own niche within the cast of characters. Or look at Foz. It's the same deal. Foz is this sort of charming asshole type of character. He's arrogant and cocky, he has some aggressive tendencies, and this undoubtedly helps him fulfill a sort of unique character role in contrast to the others, who all lack these sorts of traits. But JD, for his part, doesn't seem to have any standout qualities like this. His personality is largely subtle and non-obvious, and for his obvious sort of qualities, he kind of has a little bit of everything. He has a little bit of assholism, a little bit of sarcasm and wit, a little bit of decision maker and calm-headedness, a little bit of confidence, a little bit of tenacity, and so on. This ties into the second reason why he comes off as underdeveloped. That is, JD doesn't seem to be passionate about anything in particular outside of the cog itself. This is especially obvious when you compare him to his two allies, Dale and Kate. Kate has a passionate streak, particularly pertaining to her heritage and her place within the Swarm War, and Dale has a passionate side about him pertaining to both scientific pursuits and being untrustworthy of the cog. And in fact, Dale kind of seems like he has hobbies, and JD doesn't. For JD, the only thing I could point out to and call a passion would be his relation with the cog, and I think this is an uninteresting quality for a main character to have. So, I'm going to cut this video a bit short. I could go further into analyzing some of these details and what they mean for JD's identity, but I don't want this to go over 30 minutes like the Dale Theory video. All I'll say is that because of everything we've discussed in this video, I think JD is a very well written and designed character, and I wish Gears of War would have more of these. There is this sort of divide going on in his personality, and although I've seen some people suggest that JD has a redemption arc, I'm not entirely convinced that this is an obvious plot path for his character in the future. And let me just add for clarification, I think that there will be two timelines going forward for both JD and Dale. He stands on this fence. On one side there's dark JD, and on the other side there's, I guess, light side JD. And to be honest, I think there's a greater chance of JD going back down the dark path, and this ties into my main theory for how Gears 6, or the storyline going forward, will play out, assuming that JD survives. But that's a discussion for another day. So check back next week, because I should have something else to say about Gears of War by then, hopefully. I might do a video on Lizzie Carmine and about how hurt I was by, her death.